Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. When the phrase or term international community is used, what is meant by it? Some would argue the political meaning applies to what is called the Washington Consensus, or what Western countries and their closest allies think. And then there's Russia and countries like it. Where do they fit in when we say the term international community? To discuss this and more, I'm joined in London by Theodora Clark. She's a conservative who is the director of Russian Art Week in London. We also have Tim McLaughlin. He's a labor blogger and an advertising man. And here in VOR's Moscow studio with me is Dmitry Babich. He's a contributor and political analyst at Voice of Russia. All right, Theodora, if I can go to you first, let's keep it simple. When you hear the term international community, what's the first thing you think about?
I'm really interested in my particular job in how the West perceives Russia. And I think the thing first we'll look at is in 2013, Forbes has actually replaced Obama with Putin as the most influential person in the world today. And I think that's starting to show the shift in the perceptions of how the West is viewing Russia. The fact that now Russia has replaced America and is being seen as this global important player in the world market today. So I think very much in terms of the last few years, we have sort of seen a reset of relations between Russia, the US, the UK. So obviously I'm based here in London, and I know we've had some differences at the St. Petersburg summit and various conferences over the last couple of years. But I do think there is a rebuilding of trust. Obviously we've got the whole history of the Cold War and how Russia's been traditionally viewed by those Western partners. But I do think there has been an improvement of relations, despite the fact we've had hiccups such as Edward Snowden.
Okay, that's a good beginning. I think of the Forbes decision. I think we should be careful not to discount that people are just dumping on Barack Obama, because if you read very carefully the reasons why Mr. Putin made it number one, it's not flattering all the time. Tim, can I ask you, when you hear the term international community, because it's bandied about a lot, what do you think of? Do you think of Russia? Do you think of China? Do you think of India? Or do you think more primarily of the UK, the United States, and its closest allies?
I think there's two different international communities that I think of, actually. And I've sort of got it very, very separate. So one, when I'm thinking about work and I'm thinking about business, I actually see a fully international community. And if I think about the work that I do every day, that includes working with colleagues in Russia and in China and in Brazil. And there's never even a single thought as to, what else is going on politically in any of those markets. It's just seen as another market and another place to work. And it doesn't make any difference. And that also includes a lot of Arab countries. And if I was to list the countries that I work with on a daily basis and actually then put them down in terms of what I might view as an international political community, it's actually very different. And what you get brought up, I grew up during the Cold War in the UK, and that has sort of continued over the last few years, I think, as Russia's had a bit of a resurgence politically. You do see a split international community. So I do very much have to, have a second thought after thinking about the international community through the original sort of five eyes of like UK, US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. That's the way that you get brought up, and that's the way you initially see things. But actually there's a whole different world that's emerging with Russia and the BRIC countries. And what's so interesting about it is that they're actually challenging what people like me were brought up to think, that actually the UK and the US view was perhaps the right way and the only way. And when we're looking at something like Edward Snowden or WikiLeaks, actually what I'm increasingly finding is that the view that I was brought up to believe in, whether that was in democracy and openness and fairness, is actually perhaps more supported by some of the BRIC countries and Russia rather than some of the Five Eyes.
Dmitry, let me give you an example. And I was on the wonderful Moscow metro system. I was coming here thinking about some of these examples, and there's so many. But countries like Syria, leaders like Assad, should not be allowed to have chemical weapons. Leaders like Mr. Assad shouldn't use chemical weapons against civilians. I'm paraphrasing what's come out of London, the British Prime Minister, and particularly President Barack Obama. And I'm going to have to agree with Tim here. When you listen to those words, the international community will not allow it. But it's the United States and its closest ally, Israel, uses chemical weapons on a regular basis. But that doesn't seem to count, because the international community is a certain group of people, and they have the rights to do certain things, even if it's above and beyond the law.
Well, I would say that when we talk about international community, there are two injustices that I see immediately. First, the majority of mankind is not part of that international community. And I'm not even talking about China or India, because China or India are usually mentioned. But we forget, for example, that the majority of the world's Muslims lives in Indonesia, not in the Arab countries even. So certainly there is a certain injustice in the fact that a small minority majority of the world is actually can even be a candidate, for being that international community. And the other problem is that in the Western countries which form this international community, I see a large discrepancy between what the elite thinks and what the people think or sometimes just feel. And my impression about that Forbes decision to put Mr. Putin as the most powerful person in the world, I think it reflects a certain mistake which is very frequent, not in the elites, but also in the people. The people in the West are sometimes so irritated by the media simplifications that you just described, that they think, okay, Putin is the alternative. Since they hate him so much, he must be really against them. He must be the real alternative. They're afraid of him.
But that's a caricature, isn't it?
But that's absolutely not true, because Putin, if you want, is a very, average politician of today's world. The problem is that he is demonized more than average. But his aspirations are actually very modest. If you look at Syria, the reason why Mr. Assad is still in his palace is because the West miscalculated. There are many people in Syria, not only the minorities. The minorities are almost 100% pro-Assad because they face annihilation if the Sunni extremists come to power. But also a lot of Sunnis are for him. So he stays in power because of this Western miscalculation. But in order to mask that miscalculation, the West says Russia is sending to Syria thousands of tons of weapons.
Or just say it, Dima. Russia has blood on its hands. This
blood
is what
on its hands,
I hear all
yes.
the time.
And these missiles. And the reality is that if Russia indeed sends arms to Syria, which I doubt, despite lots of claims by various parties, it cannot be on big scale, because these weapons should go through Iran and through Iraq, which are not exactly the biggest allies of Russia.
Well, we'll talk about Iran a little bit. Theodore, if I can go to you, one of the things I found quite humorous over the last few days is there was an American congressman that came out and said that the French people, and I think by extension the Germans and the British and the Spanish and the Italians, should celebrate the NSA's spying on the populations of Western Europe because of the Americans and the international community are protecting their security interests. This is one of the things that really irritates me a lot, is that conflating what the West thinks is important to itself must be important to the rest of the world.
Well, I think the first thing to say is obviously very serious to have, for example, Angela Merkel's phone being tapped by the Americans. I don't think we should have any kind of spying of our traditional strong allies. But actually, I wanted to pick up on a point you made about Syria as well. And in Russia's defense, I think they actually have made a very important role in the Syrian crisis. And if we look at the G20 summit that we've just had in St. Petersburg, it was very much, Barack Obama actually speaking to Putin about what they could do to reduce the chemical weapons arsenal. And I think that if it wasn't for Russia playing such an important role, we wouldn't have maybe had such a diplomatic solution as we have had with the Syrian crisis and with the Assad regime. So I do think Russia has a very important role to play in the international community. And traditionally
Well, Tim, if I could pick up on that, let's go back to this, the G8 summit in St. Petersburg. Again, I find it just quite astounding reading Western media is that Vladimir Putin was isolated, which by any reckoning at all, it was Barack Obama that was isolated. And I would even go as far as to say that Mr. Putin actually spoke for the international community to some degree or another, not wanting to see another general war in the greater Middle East. But the way Western media portrayed it is that Putin was all alone, when in fact, if you look at media around the world, I'm not going to profess to know many foreign languages, but I've read enough translations that most people applauded Russia's position. We don't have to say Mr. Putin specifically, but Russia's position in defending and reflecting international opinion.
Yeah, I think that's right, because you can take the UK as a microcosm of that in some sense, because you had the UK government trying to side with the US government in terms of having some sort of military action against Syria. You had a lot of public opinion in the UK that was against that, and the Parliament in the UK then ended up voting against it, which was perhaps a side that Russia and Putin put forward themselves. And one of the things I find very interesting is the difference between perhaps what you might be led to believe and what people actually think. So what you might see reported, or what you might see some of the political leaders in the West talk about, and what people actually think and what they want, isn't necessarily the same thing. And when you think about Syria, what's happening now is a discussion about which stakeholders and which countries should be involved in a Geneva II conference to get the two sides, the opposition and the current Syrian government, together to talk about a peaceful solution. That's a very different debate to the one that Barack Obama and to some extent David Cameron's government here tried to instigate a few months ago, where it was actually about military action. And I think what's quite interesting is that a lot of that has been instigated by Russia, But if you look at the media and you read it here, it's actually very hard to realise that that's actually the case. You've got to go and find it because people aren't really interested in telling that story. And I think that's always happened. And that's partly because of the history. So that's partly because of the Cold War and what went before, that Russia has always seen as something different that people don't really understand. And one of the things you've got to remember as well, that it's only a 3.5-hour flight from London to Moscow. But when you land there, it does feel very different. And I think in some ways that is still coming across.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. I'm joined by Theodora Clark, Tim McLaughlin, and Dmitry Babich. Dmitry, let's look at Iran and the international community. Again, if you look at General Assembly votes at the United Nations, there is a call for a peaceful, negotiated resolution of the conflict between Iran and Western powers, not the international community. Again, if you look at the international community, most people say, look at the law, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has the right to civilian nuclear power like any other country that signs that agreement. But if you look at the Financial Times, or the Washington Post, and New York Times, no, the international community wants Iran on its knees.
Well, I think that one of the problems with the so-called international community, I say so-called, because very often, as we just discussed, this role is usurped by the Western media and the Western elite. The problem with this international community is that it has a very short memory.
Well, can we start calling it the Washington Consensus? Because that's what I prefer.
All right, if you want. But, for example, today I watched a program on CNN about the horrors of living in Raqqa, the only provincial capital in Syria which is controlled by the opposition, and the opposition happens to be Islamists. And the correspondent was describing how people get their fingers cut off for stealing, how people are being beaten for drawing graffiti on walls. And the correspondent never mentioned that initially the United States and the European Union supported all of the Syrian opposition, and they just refused to admit that there were any bad elements inside that opposition. They said that, it was people versus the dictator, people against Assad. And the same thing with Iran. I mean, right now, for example, yesterday I read in the New York Times an article by the former US ambassador to Afghanistan and Iraq, who wrote that actually Iran happened to help the United States to topple the Taliban regime in Kabul. This was never reported before, but
but you could find this out if you look deep enough.
If you look deep enough, as Tim just rightly said, people just forget certain things, and the Washington Consensus, or the media serving that Washington Consensus, quickly forgets certain things. So there was cooperation with Iran, and then this cooperation was cut short by Bush's excess of evil speech, and everyone already forgot about that. Now we are discussing sanctions against Iran. Then we discuss reconciliation with Iran. The problem with the Washington Consensus is that it changes allies and good guys like gloves.
Or maybe you could say, actually, in the last couple of years with the advent of the Arab Spring, is that some of the traditional allies of the Washington Consensus are leaving. We can look at Saudi Arabia, we can look at Turkey, we can look at other countries like that are saying, but the Washington Consensus doesn't work for us anymore.
You don't even have to look at the big picture. Just look at Syria. 2 years ago, we were said that National Syrian Council is the only legitimate representative of the Syrian people. Then in 6 months, Mrs. Clinton tells us, forget about National Syrian Council. Forget about it. It's nothing. Syrian National Coalition is the only legitimate representative of the Syrian people.
We'll see what it is in 6 months. Theodora, we've all mentioned in this program, which I think is really interesting, is that, and I won't name names, but in the time that I've been doing this program on Voice of Russia, a number of colleagues in London had a Freudian slip. Instead of saying Russia, they said the Soviet Union. But it does happen. And I think this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do the program, because Russia plays an important role in the international community in a literal sense, the way I'm using it, because it goes to the United Nations. It works. The chemical weapons deal with Syria is the best example. Rely upon diplomacy. But this is not the perception of Russia in the general public or how it's driven by the media. I mean, somehow Putin snookered Obama instead of saying, rational minds came to fore.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. There is definitely an issue with the history, as you said, of calling Russia the Soviet Union. I mean, obviously my background's in the arts, and we work a lot with, artists who are having a very difficult time in Russia at the moment with issues with censorship and issues with freedom. Of course, I get asked a lot of the time about, Pussy Riot, the impact of the homosexuality laws on the a major festival of contemporary art for the Biennale next year in St. Petersburg. But I also wanted to use another example of the way that this sort of tit for tat between Russia and America has still been going on now for a number of years since the end of the Cold War. Just in 2012, so just last year, we've obviously had Putin signing that bill which is banning any United States citizens from adopting children from Russia. And I looked up the statistic this morning, and the Russians claimed that this was because Russian children, are dying of torture who've been in the US. But actually, it's crazy that there are 60,000 children who've been adopted in the United States, and only 20 have died. So I think this is very much a response to the Magnitsky Act, and you can see how they're actually using people's lives. I mean, this is people adopting children, is actually being traded in tit for tat in terms of political agreements. So I think very much this kind of background and the history of the Cold War is still very much alive and well in particular issues like that.
Theodora, I'm sorry, I have to correct you. 20 children were killed or rather murdered by their parents in the United States. Of course, the number of children who died is much higher because a lot of children who were adopted were sick, they had various kinds of diseases. So, the prohibition was not because there were many children who died in the United States, because, of course, a lot of courageous step-parents in the United States adopted sick children, and sometimes these children died. That's understandable. The problem was about these 20 children who were murdered by their step-parents, and it was also legally proven. It was not like Astachov or someone said it.
Oh,
it was
also
course,
that young kid, I don't know, it was like 12 or so, that his mother gave him a ticket and a note and said, go back to where you came from. And I mean, Theodore, I think this is a very complicated issue. But
I agree in general.
I think sensible people, we could find common ground on that. But there are public opinion involved here. And when Russians see children of their ethnicity leave under circumstances that should be very positive for a positive life moving forward, and they're murdered, public opinion does kick in here. Public opinion is just as powerful in Russia as it is in any other country, and we can go through the issues of the gay laws and things like that. People have very strong opinions here, and presumably politicians are supposed to react to public opinion. Tim, do you want to jump in on that?
I think the gay law is very interesting, as well as some of the reports of racism in the match against from CSK Moscow and Manchester City a couple of weeks ago. Because what I'm finding again is that the media and public opinion jumps all over it and then forgets that actually we haven't got everything in order in our own house at the moment. And actually what's really interesting is that if we're talking about an international community and what Russia's role is in that, you can say, well, on the one hand, you can see Russia as a counterweight, providing a balanced argument that's actually led to, say, a peaceful solution, or hopefully one in Syria, versus what can often be portrayed as a deliberate block. And I think when we're seeing these arguments sort of around some issues such as the homosexuality laws, what you then end up with, and it's not just in the UK, you end up with the Amsterdam mayor refusing to meet Putin earlier this year, and there's been problems between the Netherlands, but there's also been problems with the UK. And what I think is that actually there's almost a desire to pick up on some of these details because it's almost symptomatic of the historical view of Russia. Whereas actually, for example, if you look at some of the homosexuality laws, they're not too different in somewhere like Turkey as towards Russia. But actually, when people talk about relations with Turkey and the rest of the EU, they conveniently forget that because Turkey is an ally of the US and the UK. And so,
well, this is what I'm getting at, Dima. And I think these issues of what's called these anti-gay laws, and we had adoption and these other issues here, is that Russia should be passive. It should follow what are deemed to be Western standards and values. And I think this is the kind of reaction against it. And I think Russia sometimes is singled out because I think in the Western mind, Russia just doesn't get it. It just won't become like us. Because I think more and more, you mentioned this report on CNN, I think most people in the West, particularly Americans, kind of say, these people in the Middle East are just not like us, and we should give up on them. But in fact, a lot of people in the Middle East have given up on Western values as well. We could talk about what's going on in Egypt.
Well, I would say that when we talk about these inflammable topics like child adoption or homosexuality laws, I think if we had a responsible international community and a responsible international press, their aim would be to sort of smoothen these inflammable issues so that they don't become a bone of contention, but they sort of unite nations. Well, I can tell you that I noticed that in every nation you have certain inflammable topics that really turn people on and that you can easily use. And usually they're connected not to the pains that people feel right now, but to the past experiences. For example, in Russia, the reason why this international adoption issue is so easily inflammable, because in Russia, when we talk about the difference of the standard of living in the West and in Russia, it always turns people, because for many decades, Russians had an impression, and sometimes it was true, we lived worse than most of the European countries. Now, if you're a rich person in Moscow, you can live better
than most people in the European Union,
I would say. Most people in the European Union or in Great Britain or other places. So the problem has been resolved in the sense that you can become rich and live nicely in Russia. But people still will have it in their minds. And in the same way, in Great Britain, homosexuality has never been a big issue in Russia. Okay, there was this article, but it was almost never used. But it was used in Great Britain.
I would argue it's not a big issue even today. Before we sat down, what film is playing in the theaters right now?
Well, this French movie that got the award, I don't remember, La Vie des Autres or something, The Life of Others. And it's okay, it's shown here, although the European media...
This is about a lesbian relationship.
Exactly.
It's playing in Moscow theaters today.
And no one notices, strangely.
Can I jump in on that
the
point?
Problem with,
about homosexuality.
I was trying to find a way to kind of... Yeah, go ahead, Theodore. Go ahead, jump in, please.
Well, just because your original question was, how does this all alter perception in the west of Russia? And that's why I think the homosexuality issue is actually very important. So obviously I run Russian Art Week, and Manifesta, the European Biennale of Contemporary Art, is scheduled to open in St. Petersburg next summer. And there have been a huge protest, getting a lot of signatures on a petition to actually move it and saying how Russia shouldn't host this major contemporary art fair. Obviously that's just a cultural example, but actually it's very important because that's what people are reading in the press, that's what they're seeing on television, and they're actually seeing reports about this. And I looked up this morning, and just to give you an idea of a couple of things, it says that foreigners can be arrested and detained for up to 15 days and deported, as well as fined 1,000 rubles if they are doing anything which is under the statute, seen to be promoting gay pride events, speaking defense of gay
Has anybody
rights.
been charged yet?
No. If only these foreigners are found guilty of propagandizing homosexuality to minors, a rather difficult thing to do, to my mind. And so far, no one has been charged. I mean, that whole thing is just a huge provocation, because people who write these things in the European press and who just simply call it anti-gay laws, they are misrepresenting the reality, because the law never even mentions homosexuality. It talks about non-traditional sexual practices
And it's about
being propagandized
dealing with minors. Okay, I need to jump in here. You're listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Tim, an article I read a couple of days ago in the Financial Times. So this week we had a Day of National Unity, a holiday most Russians do not know of yet. It'll take time to catch on. And unfortunately, I think, Dean, it was 8,000 protesters took to the streets, and most of them were nationalists.
On the Ruski March,
Well, and
10,000.
10,000, okay. And
10,000 responded to Navalny's call to go.
Okay, we'll do Mr. Navalny another program. But Tim, I looked at a lot of pictures of it in Russian media, and there was a flag there was a swastika. But the FT made it sound like the entire group of people were sympathizers to Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. And again, this is trying to show that Russia is not part of the West, part of the civilized international community. Because most people that I come across, I've lived here for 15 years, the very thought of a swastika really makes people sick.
I mean, that's my experience. I've been to Russia. I have friends who are Russian who I talk to all the time, and their view of it is exactly the same as yours. And I think what's interesting is there's been a lot of discussion in the UK about the English Defence League. They've been infiltrating a lot of young groups, trying to go to a lot of football matches. There's been a lot of protests there, but I don't know whether that's actually been reported in the Russian media. But in some ways, perhaps they're not quite as extreme as getting out swastika flags, but to be honest, it's a similar sort of movement, and yet I don't see that as being something that's symbolic of UK society or public opinion. And if you're saying that there were 8,000 or 10,000 people out a couple of days ago, that is a very insignificant number to me. But clearly, you've got a desire to pick up on things and to highlight them, to present a sort of different image of Russia, and sort of almost like you have a hypothesis and you find the evidence afterwards, rather than using the evidence to create a hypothesis. And I think that's what's going on there.
Theodore, one of the problems I'm perplexed with when I look at coverage of Russia is that I see a lot of the problems in Western countries and whatever, we can say Western public opinion and the international community as we started this program. I see the problems are remarkably similar, but I don't understand why some countries are cast in such a different light, so different than the other countries. And we've been mentioning here the rise of racism and nationalism. I see that all through Europe. I see it in Britain, and it's an unfortunate part of life here, though I don't see it as being nearly as significant as it's reported in Western media.
Well, I think Tim's absolutely right in the point he just made. I think every country always struggles with having a particular group of people in society who've got very extreme views, but they are not representative of, say, the whole of the UK population. And the example of the march you've just used, as you said, a couple of thousand people out of a population of tens of millions is really a very, very small proportion. But I think every country has the same issue. I mean, one of the things I do every morning is actually to read the front pages in different newspapers around the world. And it may be exactly the same story, but how it's reported on the front page of the New York Times, Le Monde, the Moscow Times, maybe exactly the same story, but every country, the way they interpret news and for their particular population is very different. So I think every country has the same problems and issues in terms of how they report world events, depending on their local population and what's of interest to their readers.
Well, I would say that I agree with Theodora, and Theodora just mentioned a very interesting thing, that usually the focus is the same in the Moscow Times, the New York Times, and the bulk of other newspapers. And that's what you can call the real Washington consensus. You know that if they write about homosexuality in Russia, they are going to mention the so-called anti-gay laws. And if they are talking about ethnic problems in Russia, they are going to say that Putin and his government are encouraging the nationalists, although Mr. Putin is in fact less nationalist than Mr. Navalny.
But in entire time I have lived here with Putin in power, starting being appointed as prime minister and then becoming president all the way to 2013, most nationalists criticize him for not being nationalistic
exactly.
enough.
Well, for example, not only the nationalists, but probably a huge part of the population demand visas for the former Soviet republics in the Central Asia. And Putin opposes that, saying that this would divide us, these are our brothers from the Soviet Union.
And who's going to do the work in Moscow?
Well, I mean, obviously he is doing that not only for humane, but for pragmatic economic reasons. But to call him a nationalist, he's certainly less nationalist than an average Russian person. He might have a lot of other shortcomings, but that's not about him. But, you have this optic. You have this sometimes very distorted optic. The media picks up the same quotes, shows the same pictures, and it misrepresents, what's going on in the world. It misrepresents it in the name of this Washington consensus. And sometimes I think it's really dangerous, like what happened in Syria, when until recently we didn't know, an average reader of Western papers didn't know that Islamists played such a big role in the Syrian rebellion. I think it's really dangerous.
Okay, Theodora, I'm going to give you the last word. What do you want to have happen during this year of culture between the UK and Russia?
Well, I think the first thing to say is it's a really unique opportunity to have an improvement of relations between Russia and the UK. Obviously, we have had a rather fraught history in the last few years, particularly obviously with the Litvinenko affair several years ago. And I think culture is probably one of the safest topics that you can choose in terms of relations between two countries. So I very much see it as an exercise in cultural diplomacy, but also a way to hopefully build links between Russian institutions and British institutions. And remember, there's an extraordinary...
People to people.
Exactly. And there's an extraordinary history of culture in both Russia and the UK. So I think it's a great common denominator, and hopefully it will build a lasting foundation for future cultural partnerships after the year.
On that note, Theodora Clark, Tim McLaughlin, and here Dima Babic sitting with me here in Moscow. You've been listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with the OR.
Partners, but I do think there has been an improvement of relations, despite the fact we've had hiccups such as Edward Snowden.
Okay, that's a good beginning. I think of the Forbes decision. I think we should be careful not to discount that people are just dumping on Barack Obama, because if you read very carefully the reasons why Mr. Putin made it number one, it's not flattering all the time. Tim, can I ask you, when you hear the term international community, because it's bandied about a lot, what do you think of? Do you think of Russia? Do you think of China? Do you think of India? Or do you think more primarily of the UK, the United States, and its closest allies?
I think there's two different international communities that I think of, actually. And I've sort of got it very, very separate. So one, when I'm thinking about work and I'm thinking about business, I actually see a fully international community. And if I think about the work that I do every day, that includes working with colleagues in Russia and in China and in Brazil. And there's never even a single thought as to, what else is going on politically in any of those markets. It's just seen as another market and another place
of Russia. All right, Theodora, if I can go to you first, let's keep it simple. When you hear the term international community, what's the first thing you think about?
I'm really interested in my particular job in how the West perceives Russia. And I think the thing first we'll look at is in 2013, Forbes has actually replaced Obama with Putin as the most influential person in the world today. And I think that's starting to show the shift in the perceptions of how the West is viewing Russia. The fact that now Russia has replaced America and is being seen as this global important player in the world market today. So I think very much in terms of the last few years, we have sort of seen a reset of relations between Russia, the US, the UK. So obviously I'm based here in London, and I know we've had some differences at the St. Petersburg summit and various conferences over the last couple of years. But I do think there is a rebuilding of trust. Obviously we've got the whole history of the Cold War and how Russia's been traditionally viewed by those Western powers.
To work, and it doesn't make any difference. And that also includes a lot of Arab countries. And if I was to list the countries that I work with on a daily basis and actually then put them down in terms of what I might view as an international political community, it's actually very different. And what you get brought up, I grew up during the Cold War in the UK, and that has sort of continued over the last few years, I think, as Russia's had a bit of a resurgence politically. You do see a split international community. So I do very much have to, have a second thought after thinking about the international community through the original sort of five eyes of like UK, US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. That's the way that you get brought up, and that's the way you initially see things. But actually there's a whole different world that's emerging with Russia and the BRIC countries. And what's so interesting about it is that they're actually challenging what people like me were brought up to think, that actually the UK and the US view was perhaps the right way and the only way. And when we're looking at something like Edward Snowden or WikiLeaks, actually what I'm increasingly finding is that the view that I was brought up to believe in
Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. When the phrase or term international community is used, what is meant by it? Some would argue the political meaning applies to what is called the Washington Consensus, or what Western countries and their closest allies think. And then there's Russia and countries like it. Where do they fit in when we say the term international community? To discuss this and more, I'm joined in London by Theodora Clark. She's a conservative who is the director of Russian Art Week in London. We also have Tim McLaughlin. He's a labor blogger and an advertising man. And here in VOR's Moscow studio with me is Dmitry Babich. He's a contributor and political analyst at Voice.
Whether that was in democracy and openness and fairness is actually perhaps more supported by some of the BRIC countries and Russia rather than some of the Five Eyes.
Dmitry, let me give you an example. And I was on the wonderful Moscow metro system. I was coming here thinking about some of these examples, and there's so many. But countries like Syria, leaders like Assad, should not be allowed to have chemical weapons. Leaders like Mr. Assad shouldn't use chemical weapons against civilians. I'm paraphrasing what's come out of London, the British Prime Minister, and particularly President Barack Obama. And I'm going to have to agree with Tim here. When you listen to those words, the international community will not allow it. But it's the United States and its closest ally, Israel, uses chemical weapons on a regular basis. But that doesn't seem to count, because the international community is a certain group of people, and they have the rights to do certain things, even if it's above and beyond the law.
Well, I would say that when we